So hi, I'm good, and I'm here to show you how increased and more damage multipliers work together to give you your final damage. Um, so, more. First rule of more is that it is multiplicative, and the second rule of more is that less is the same thing, it just is better less than 1. That's all it is. And they stack together. They're multiplicative with each other, and they're multiplicative with each other. That's all they do. They only act as multipliers. So the increased damage is a multiplier unto itself. That you take all the increases, add them together, and you get your final damage multiplier. So you get one multiplier out of that. All your other gems, for instance, they can have their own multipliers, like the melee physical damage gem has its own multiplier. Point blank has its own multiplier. Like the weapon elemental damage gem has its own multiplier. And you can kind of see how if you stack a whole bunch of these tiny multipliers, you can get pretty big numbers out of it. So I can walk through a couple examples, like a physical damage melee attack. So we have a base physical damage, like this would be the damage on the weapon itself. So if we had 125 top end physical damage on the weapon, we have the total increased damage multiplier, so that'd be 4, the melee physical damage gem, melee physical on full life gem, melee splash, which is multiplier, but it's less than 1, so it's less damage. The multi-strike gem, which is again a multiplier, but it's less damage. And the total increased damage taken, so if an enemy is taking twice as much damage, that effectively counts as its own little multiplier. Then say if they were cursed with vulnerability, which gives more physical damage taken. So that's a multiplier to the physical damage taken. And from our initial hit of 125 on our weapon, the final multiplier we can get is around 12, so our final damage is about 1,500, which is pretty good. So you can see how tiny things can stack together to make really big numbers. My Burn Wander was actually a perfect example of this, because it would scale up tiny amounts of base fire damage, so a little bit of fire damage on gear, the anger aura, and you can get pretty absurd numbers like this burn, for instance. But we can kind of walk through and see how all this math actually works. So this is my puncture bowman guy. I use a chin soul, I use point blank with puncture to get really high damages. And we can kind of walk through how much damage a split arrow would do. So currently I have split arrow linked with chain. Those are two of the multipliers on it. And that's all it can be accounted for in the tooltip. So if I change this to only account for split arrow and chain, you can see I have a 272 top end physical damage. So if I take all the increases, add them together, get a total, that's our total multiplier for increased. Then this is from our gems, and that's our base damage. We multiply those three things together, and we get our top end hit damage, which is 273 if we round up. And lo and behold, in the game it says 273, so the math does actually work. But what if we account for all the things that aren't actually accounted for, like the point blank and the chin soul, and the fact that we can do crits, and if we use projectile weakness and vulnerability? So if we account for all those extra multipliers, you can that roll. You can see that it's 4,500 physical damage top end on a chain split arrow, which is pretty devastating. So, you know, if I applied this over to the puncture, like if a puncture hit for that much, you know, it could do quite a bit of damage. The dog's going crazy. So, you can see how the Burn Wander would actually, or how the build actually works for the math. So it's a small amount of base fire damage, and then it's multiplied by the increased fire damage and increased weapon elemental damage, all that's added together. For the final increased, I had about 2.3-ish. And then there's weapon elemental damage gem, which gives a multiplier. The power siphon skill has its own damage effectiveness, and then I have the crit strike multiplier, which is the thing then being boosted by the crit weakness curse for around 11 on 11 times normal damage on a crit. But then there's also projectile weakness for another multiplier. Then there's shock for another multiplier. And then there's the elemental weakness and elemental equilibrium for minus 100% resist. I mean, if they have 100% negative fire resist, they take twice as much fire damage. So that's also its own little multiplier. So I had a tooltip fire damage hit of around 1,300. But after I accounted for all the things along with a crit, I had a fire damage hit of around 72,000. And because I also did some lightning damage, I would do a hit of around 100,000, and that was enough to actually one-shot myself to reflect. So at some point I had to take out the weapon elemental damage gem to control my damage so I didn't one-shot myself to reflect, which is kind of surprising. But ignite damage, but that would also cause an ignite. So the ignite damage is a third of your initial hit damage a second for 4 seconds. So the base ignite DOT is 24,000. That's being multiplied by the increased burning damage the character had, which was 1.6. So at about 40,000 effective ignite DPS. But then there was also shock, and then there was also the minus 9% resist again, which would make my character have an effective burn DPS of around 145,000 damage a second. So even with a garbage wand, like, this character could actually use a driftwood wand and still do good damage because of just how well the multipliers worked. So you can also see how if I removed, say, if the enemy was so overcapped on resistances, they had like 175% resist, even if I took off 100% resist, they would still be at 75% resist. So if I account for that, you can see how much I'm relying on these multipliers. So I would go from 145,000 to like 2,000 effective burn damage if everything was stacked against me. So that's how a couple of my characters worked, and how they could get as much damage as they could with relatively bad gear. So anyways, I'm good, and I'll see you next time. The next episode is going to be covering converted damage, which is a pretty confusing topic. Anyways, I'll see you next time.